Every Tuesday, I baked a pie. For some, it was just a pastry, but for me, it was a promise of love, the homey comfort I tried so hard to preserve. But that Tuesday, when I opened the door to my millionaire son, he looked at me not as his mother, but as a bothersome obstacle. He wanted my house, my inheritance. But the worst betrayal was not even that. What happens when your millionaire son takes everything you hold dear and turns your life into ruins? I thought the worst was already behind me, but at my own funeral, where he showed up in my favorite old dress, he told me it was the best outfit I could have left for myself. He was wrong, and he will regret it. They say a good deed is its own reward. I've always thought that was a crock of hooey, a flimsy excuse people use when they don't get a thank you note. But after what happened last Tuesday, I'm starting to believe there's a cosmic ledger, and I've just had a massive deposit yanked right back out. It all started with a simple act of kindness, the kind of thing a mother does without thinking twice. A heroic act, really, if you ask me. It was a Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday that feels like it's mocking you with its oppressive cheeriness. The sun was a relentless bully, beating down on my meticulously manicured front lawn. The heat was so thick you could chew it. I had just finished baking a triple-layered chocolate cake for my neighbor, old Mrs. Gable, who'd been laid up with a bad case of the shingles. She's a sweet little thing, all wrinkles and good intentions, and she needed a bit of cheering up. The cake was a masterpiece, a dark, decadent monument to maternal affection, frosted with the buttercream so rich it could pay off a small debt. My kitchen smelled like a bakery from a dream, and I felt a quiet, satisfying pride as I carefully placed the last cherry on top. It was the sort of perfect moment that should have been captured in a magazine, a testament to a life well lived and a heart still full of generosity. The doorbell chimed just as I was wiping my hands on my apron. I assumed it was Mrs. Gable's granddaughter, who promised to pick up the cake. I swung the door open, a warm smile on my face, ready to hand over my sweet creation. But it wasn't the granddaughter. It was my son, Daniel. And he wasn't alone. He had brought along his wife, Tiffany. The air immediately turned cold, a stark contrast to the stifling heat outside. The smile froze on my face. Daniel was my only child, my pride and joy. But lately, joy seemed to be a currency we no longer traded in. He had become a stranger, a polished, expensive version of the boy I raised, now with a layer of condescending frost. He and Tiffany, with her perfect blonde hair and perpetually pursed lips, looked less like family and more like a pair of visiting dignitaries here to inspect the peasantry. "Hello, Mother," Daniel said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. He barely glanced at the cake in my hands. His eyes, once so full of mischief and love, were now cool and appraising, as if calculating the resale value of my front door. I tried to break the awkward silence. "Daniel, Tiffany, what a surprise! I was just baking a cake for Mrs. Gable." I gestured at the cake, hoping the sweet scent would melt the ice. It didn't. Tiffany wrinkled her nose as if the smell of home-baked goods was offensive. "We need to talk, Mother," Daniel said, his tone shifting to something more formal, more businesslike. "This is important." My heart sunk. That phrase, "this is important," was his verbal equivalent of a financial advisor's grimace. It always meant bad news. I ushered them inside, the cake feeling heavy in my hands. I placed it on the kitchen counter, its deliciousness a forgotten offering. I felt a knot form in my stomach. The air in my home, which moments ago had been filled with the scent of chocolate and the warmth of a good deed, was now thick with tension. I led them to the living room, a space filled with family photos and decades of memories, a place that had always felt safe. Now, with them sitting on my couch, it felt like a courtroom. Tiffany sat ramrod straight, her expensive handbag clutched in her lap, her eyes darting around the room, taking in every detail with thinly veiled disapproval. Daniel leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together, looking all the world like a CEO about to announce a massive layoff. The sight of my boy, who used to beg for my cookies and run through this very room with scraped knees, now looking so cold and distant, was a betrayal in itself. I had always imagined this home would be a place of comfort and happiness for my children and grandchildren. Now it felt like a stage for a hostage takeover. I had given my entire life to my family. I had poured every ounce of my love, energy, and resources into raising my son to be a good, honorable man. I helped him with his college tuition, his first car, and his down payment on his own home. I was the rock, the foundation, the one who never asked for anything in return. And now, he was here, looking at me, not as his mother, but as a bothersome obstacle. It was a slap in the face, a betrayal so sharp it took my breath away. And the most painful part was not even that. You won't believe what happened next. The truth came out, and it was so much worse than a simple argument. You'll want to stay to see the entire story unfold. The situation escalated in a way you could never imagine.
The house, Daniel repeated, his voice as flat and unfeeling as a gravestone. Tiffany and I have been discussing it at length. You're getting older, Mother. The upkeep on this place is significant, and let's be honest, the neighborhood isn't what it used to be. It's time for you to downsize. My blood ran cold. Downsize? My home, the place where I had raised him, where every chipped tile and faded wallpaper pattern held a memory, was suddenly a burden? Downsize to where, Daniel? A shoebox apartment? A retirement community where they serve mush for dinner and schedule your bowel movements? The sarcasm was a defense mechanism, a shield against the utter audacity of his words. Tiffany, who had been silent until now, chimed in with a saccharine sweetness that made my teeth ache. Oh no, Mrs. Harrison, not at all. We found the most wonderful senior living community. It's called Golden Acres. They have bingo nights, gardening clubs, all the things you love. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that startled them both. Bingo? I don't love bingo, Tiffany. I love my garden. I love my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, and the way her cat, Mittens, sits on my fence and glares at me. I love waking up in my own bed, not a sterile room where someone else decides when I can have a cookie. The more I spoke, the more indignant I became. This wasn't a suggestion. It was an eviction notice wrapped in a floral-patterned lie. He sighed, a sound of supreme exasperation, as if I were a child refusing to take my medicine. Mother, this isn't negotiable. The market is hot right now. We can sell this house for a fantastic price. It's a gold mine, sitting here gathering dust while you bake cakes. He gestured dismissively toward the kitchen. The cake, my monument of maternal affection, was suddenly a symbol of my frivolous, outdated existence. It was an insult so direct it was almost comical. Gold mine, I retorted, my voice rising. This isn't just a house, Daniel. It's our home. I worked for 40 years to pay for this. Your father and I built this life with our own two hands. And you have my eternal gratitude, he said, the words ringing hollow. But now it's our turn. The truth is, Tiffany and I have a great opportunity. We're launching a new venture and we need capital. This house, your house, is the key. He said it so matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing a stock option, not the sacred ground of my life's work. It was a cold, transactional betrayal. My home was collateral, and I was the loan he was cashing in on. Tiffany nodded eagerly. The money from the sale would give us a massive head start. We can pay you back, eventually. We'll set up a monthly allowance for you at Golden Acres. You'll be comfortable. The way she said comfortable made it sound like a life sentence. My head spun. I stared at them. A couple of strangers dressed in designer clothes, sitting in my living room and calmly planning to sell the roof over my head? My son, the boy I had read bedtime stories to, the one I had stitched up after a bike accident, the man I had sacrificed everything for, was now looking at my life as a line item on a spreadsheet? So, you're saying you're kicking me out? I whispered, the absurdity of it all hitting me like a physical blow. We prefer to call it relocating for mutual benefit, Daniel corrected, his perfect veneer cracking just enough to show the monster underneath. It's a smart financial move for everyone. The irony was not lost on me. I had just finished an act of pure kindness for a sick neighbor, and my own flesh and blood was here, plotting my displacement. I was an inconvenience, a financial liability, a relic of a past he was eager to forget. The sting of this emotional fraud was far worse than any legal battle could ever be. This was not a disagreement. It was a hostile act of emotional violence, a declaration of war from the people I had always believed were on my side. The world was suddenly upside down, and I felt a chilling sense of foreboding. The worst part was, I knew this was only the beginning. What came next wasn't just about my house, it was about the very foundation of my life. You won't believe the lengths my son and daughter-in-law went to in order to get what they wanted. They left as abruptly as they had arrived, leaving behind a silence so deafening it buzzed in my ears. I stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the empty couch where my son and his trophy wife had just sat, dissecting my life like a frog in a high school biology class. The air, once thick with their smug arrogance, now felt hollow. The perfect chocolate cake for Mrs. Gable sat on the counter, an ironic monument to the life I thought I had, a life built on love and sacrifice, not on market values and venture capital. I wanted to scream, to shatter the delicate china in the dining room, to grab a hammer and make the walls crumble. Instead, I stood motionless, my mind replaying Daniel's words. It's a smart financial move for everyone. The cold, corporate jargon he used to justify emotional plunder was a new low, even for him. For my son, the boy who used to cling to my leg and cry when I left for the grocery store, my home was now a business asset, a line item on his balance sheet. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was an annihilation of everything I had ever believed about family, duty, and unconditional love. The foundation of my existence was not just shaken, it was being meticulously dismantled, piece by piece. And I was expected to smile and thank them for the privilege. That night, sleep was a cruel joke. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Tiffany's self-satisfied smirk and Daniel's calculating gaze. I got up, a ghost in my own home, and wandered through the silent rooms. I ran my hand over the banister, thinking of how many times Daniel had slid down it, laughing. I traced the faint scratch on the hardwood floor from his tricycle, a mark I had always cherished. Now, these cherished memories felt like ghosts, mocking me, reminding me that the person they belonged to no longer existed. He had been replaced by a stranger in a tailored suit who thought my memories had a sell-by date. The emotional toll of this was heavier than I could have ever imagined. It was a loneliness that gnawed at my bones, the profound and chilling realization that the people I loved the most were capable of treating me with such cold indifference. The next morning, the silence was broken not by the cheerful chirping of birds, but by the relentless buzzing of my phone. It was Daniel. The screen showed his name, but to me, it was just a label for a thief who wanted not my wallet, but my entire life. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend this was all a terrible dream, but I knew I couldn't. This was their game, and they were not going to let me forfeit. I finally answered, my voice a shaky whisper. "Hello?" "Mother, did you get the email I sent you?" he asked,
his voice brisk and impatient, as if I were a slow-witted employee who couldn't follow simple instructions. Email? What email? I had barely managed to make coffee. My brain was still trying to process the concept of being made homeless by my own son. The legal documents. I need you to sign them and return them to me by the end of the week. They're for transferring the title of the house to my name. It's for your own good, Mother. This way, we can manage the sale more efficiently. My blood pressure must have skyrocketed. My hand, holding the phone, trembled. I knew in my heart that this wasn't for my good. This was a hostile takeover, a legal maneuver to take everything I had and leave me with nothing. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He wasn't even pretending anymore. There was no mention of downsizing or senior living. This was a straightforward demand, and the phrase, "for your own good," was just the slick, rotten cherry on top of the betrayal. I felt a surge of adrenaline. The shock was starting to curdle into a potent, fiery rage. He thought I was just some old woman, easily manipulated, a relic to be moved aside. He thought I would just sign over my life's work without a fight. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He had forgotten the woman who had worked 3 jobs to put him through college, the woman who had a spine of steel and a will of iron. The polite, sweet mother he remembered was gone. In her place was a woman who just realized she had to fight for her life. I took a deep breath, my voice now clear and steady. "Daniel, I'm not signing anything." His silence on the other end of the line was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a plan hitting a snag, of a perfectly polished veneer finally cracking. He had expected compliance, not defiance. This was the moment I stopped being a victim and started being a warrior. I hung up the phone. The fight had just begun, and what happened next would prove just how wrong they were about me. My story isn't about giving up. It's about a mother's revenge. You won't believe the shocking lengths I had to go to save myself from the people I loved most. The silence after I hung up was the most potent thing in the room. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet ticking of a bomb I was finally ready to disarm. My hand, which had trembled with fear moments ago, was now steady, a fist clenched around the receiver. He expected me to fall apart, to crumble into a puddle of tears and compliance. What he didn't realize was that he had just lit a fire under a woman who had spent 60-plus years being everyone's rock. I was a mother, a widow, a survivor. I was not a line item. The first thing I did was try to call my lawyer, a portly old man named Mr. Thompson who had handled my late husband's estate. I was so mad I was practically spitting fire. The phone rang and then went to voicemail. I left a message, a jumbled, breathless rant about my treacherous son and his soulless wife. I felt a small, fleeting sense of victory. At least someone knew what was happening. I felt less alone. Then the second shoe dropped. I had to tell Mrs. Gable that I couldn't deliver the cake, a small, sad admission of defeat. I walked the cake over myself, the sun still beating down on me, the buttercream frosting beginning to soften at the edges. When Mrs. Gable opened her door, she looked not with the familiar warmth I expected, but with a strange, hesitant pity. "Dear," she said, her voice unusually low, "are you feeling all right? I heard things were getting difficult." My heart pounded. What had she heard? Daniel and Tiffany had left only yesterday. The speed of this was terrifying. "Difficult? What do you mean?" I asked, my voice thin. Mrs. Gable wrung her hands. "Well, your son, he stopped by a few days ago before you baked this beautiful cake, and he seemed very concerned. He said you weren't yourself, that you were unpredictable and frequently confused." The last words hung in the air between us like a foul odor. A cold wave of realization washed over me, a gut-wrenching, soul-crushing moment of clarity.
This wasn't just a simple case of greed. This was a premeditated psychological attack. They were building a narrative, a vicious, insidious lie designed to discredit me, to make me seem crazy, to make their theft of my home look like a compassionate act. They weren't just trying to steal my home. They were trying to steal my sanity, my credibility, and my place in this world. The money was just a bonus. The true prize was my reputation, the life I had built on a foundation of respect and trust. Confused? I repeated, my voice now a whisper. Unpredictable? My hands, which had so carefully baked the cake for her, now felt like lead weights. He's the one who's a monster. He's trying to take my home. Mrs. Gable's eyes filled with tears, a mix of pity and fear. I know, dear, it sounds so terrible. But he said he was just doing it to protect you, that he was worried you might do something rash. He even showed me some emails and text messages. Things he said proved you weren't well. The venom of their lies was unbelievable. The sheer, unadulterated evil of it all. It was one thing to be betrayed for money. It was another to be psychologically tortured, to have my own child weaponize my life against me. They hadn't just come to me with a threat. They had already been to the neighbors, the friends, the community, laying the groundwork for my downfall, making sure no one would believe me when I finally screamed for help. The realization hit me with the force of a train. I was alone, completely and utterly alone in this fight. My own child had made sure of it. I left the cake with a speechless Mrs. Gable and stumbled back to my house. The silence that greeted me this time wasn't peaceful. It was a suffocating shroud. I felt trapped, surrounded by a conspiracy so vile it defied imagination. My own son, my flesh and blood, had built a prison of lies around me, and I was the only inmate. My old life was gone, replaced by a nightmare from which there was no waking up. This was no longer about a house. It was about my soul, my mind, my very existence. The emotional war had just begun, and the first shot had been fired straight at my heart. The shocking depths of their conspiracy were still a mystery. You won't believe the vile secrets they were keeping and what it took for me to uncover them and fight back. The next morning, the shroud of silence from the day before was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I had spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment with Daniel and Tiffany. The discovery of their whispered campaign of lies was a betrayal far deeper than the attempt to take my house. They were not just after my money, they were after my mind, my dignity, my very identity. The polite, sweet woman who baked cakes for sick neighbors was dead. In her place was a woman forged in the fires of righteous indignation. They wanted a war? Fine. They had one. My first move was to re-examine everything. If they were so brazen as to lie to Mrs. Gable's face, what else had they done behind my back? My mind, now a steel trap, went over recent events. My bank statements, my tax documents, the trust I had set up for Daniel years ago. The paranoia that had been a fleeting shadow now felt like a very real, very dark companion. I pulled out my file cabinet, a sturdy metal monument to my long-held belief in meticulous record-keeping. George, my late husband, had always said I was a hoarder of documents, but now, every receipt and faded legal paper felt like a weapon. I called Mr. Thompson again. This time he picked up on the second ring, his voice weary. "Eleanor, I got your message. Are you all right?" It sounded a bit frantic. My newfound calm was a stark contrast to my previous call. "I'm fine, Mr. Thompson. I'm just furious. And I've come to a few conclusions. First, Daniel and Tiffany are trying to steal my house. Second, they've been spreading malicious lies about my mental state. And third, I have a very bad feeling about the trust I set up for him years ago." His voice sobered. "The Harrison family trust? Daniel and Tiffany came in a month ago asking questions about it. I told them you were the sole trustee and beneficiary." My blood ran cold. They had been planning this for months. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This wasn't a recent impulse born of financial need.
This was a long-term calculated strategy. It was a testament to a level of deceit I couldn't have imagined. They did what? My voice was low, dangerous. Mr. Thompson, I need you to pull every single document related to that trust. And I need to know if there's any way they could have accessed it without my knowledge. His silence on the other end was more damning than any verbal confirmation. I'll look into it, Eleanor. It's highly unlikely, but I'll check. He sounded skeptical, but I knew in my gut that something was wrong. My life had become a series of horrifying truths, each one more shocking than the last. I hung up and started to go through my old files, searching for anything amiss. Nothing. My hands shook as I sifted through papers. I knew I hadn't given them permission to do anything with the trust. It was an unbreakable legal document, meant to provide for my security in my later years. Then I saw it. Tucked away in the back of my desk drawer, a document I didn't recognize. It was a stack of papers, seemingly benign, but the letterhead was from Daniel's new company. The first page was a seemingly innocuous business proposal, but buried deep within the fine print, my eyes scanned something that made me gasp. A single line of text. All assets held in the Harrison Family Trust will be used as collateral for the new venture with the full and complete approval of the beneficiary, signed and dated here. My head spun. There, on the bottom of the page, was my signature, my name, scribbled in what looked like my own handwriting. My stomach lurched. This wasn't just a threat. This was a direct criminal act of forgery. I had never seen this document. I had never signed it. They had forged my name. The depth of their depravity was staggering. My son wasn't just a greedy opportunist. He was a criminal. He had not only tried to steal my house and reputation, he had gone one step further and committed a federal crime. A move so ruthless it took my breath away. He was willing to risk everything, including his own freedom, to take what was mine. I stared at the forged signature, a grotesque mockery of my name, and I knew that this was a war from my life itself. My rage boiled over. The polite, sweet woman who baked cakes was truly gone, and in her place was a woman forged in the fires of righteous indignation. They wanted a war? Fine. They had one. This was no longer just about family. It was a descent into a world of crime and deception, and I was about to expose every last one of their secrets. You won't believe how far I was willing to go to fight back against my own son.
I stood there, the forged document a flimsy, mocking piece of paper in my hand. My signature, a scribble of ink that represented my life's work, my husband's legacy, and my financial security, had been counterfeited by my own son. The audacity of it was breathtaking. My initial shock had given way to a cold, burning fire in my gut. This wasn't just a betrayal for money. This was a direct, personal assault. They didn't just want my assets, they wanted to erase me. To prove that I was nothing more than a senile old woman who couldn't even tell a forged signature from her own. I called Mr. Thompson again, my voice surprisingly calm. "Mr. Thompson, I have the document. I'm coming to your office." His protest was instant. "Eleanor, don't you think we should wait? This is a serious matter. We need to plan." "We don't have time to plan," I said, my voice as sharp and cold as a winter wind. "They're moving fast, and so am I. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I hung up before he could argue. My mind was a whirlwind of rage and determination. The polite, grieving mother was a ghost of a past life. The woman who stood in her place was a force of nature. I had a forged document and I had proof of their deceit. Now I needed to know the full extent of it. When I arrived at Mr. Thompson's office, he looked horrified. "Eleanor, you look like you're going to a funeral." He wasn't entirely wrong. I was dressed in a sharp black suit, the one I wore to George's funeral. The suit felt like armor. I handed him the document. He looked at it, his eyes widening in disbelief, and then at me with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. "Eleanor, this is a felony,"
he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "This is not just a family dispute. This is a crime." "I know," I said, a grim smile on my face, "and I want to know what they did with the money." He ran a quick search, and what he found made my blood run cold. It wasn't for Daniel's new business venture. The money, my money, the money that was supposed to secure my future, had been used to buy a sprawling, opulent yacht. The name of the yacht, printed on a financial statement, was a cruel, sickening punch to the gut. The Eleanor's Legacy. My name etched into the side of their lavish, floating monument to greed. A yacht. Not a business, not a life-changing investment, a symbol of their blatant, narcissistic contempt for me. They had used my life's savings, my husband's legacy, to buy a toy. They slapped my name on it, a final, sadistic joke. They were not just thieves, they were sociopaths. The sheer cruelty of it was beyond anything I had ever imagined. My son, my flesh and blood, had stolen my security and then used my own name to rub it in my face. The depths of this betrayal were so profound they were almost beautiful in their twisted, evil logic. The next few days were a blur of cold, calculated actions. I went to the bank and changed every password, every security question. I called my utility companies and put everything in my name with no authorized users. I was a fortress, and I was sealing myself off from the enemy. But I knew that wasn't enough. They had slandered my name. They had stolen my money. They had tried to erase me. I couldn't just hide. I had to expose them. I had to make them feel a fraction of the pain they had inflicted upon me. The time for quietly fighting was over. The time for a public spectacle had begun. My final act was the most shocking of all. I decided to confront them not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. I knew where they were hosting a launch party for Daniel's so-called new venture, a grand, lavish affair attended by all the people they had lied to, the people they had so carefully convinced that I was a burden, a problem to be solved. They underestimated me. They thought I was old and weak. They had no idea that I was about to become the biggest problem of their lives. You won't believe the scene I made or how I used their own arrogance to bring them to their knees. This was the moment I became a legend in our community.
The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and cheap ambition. The launch party for Daniel's new venture was held in the glass-walled penthouse of a downtown skyscraper, a place so high up you could look down on the lives of ordinary people. It felt like a stage set for a play I had no intention of applauding. Waiters in starched white jackets moved through the crowd with silver platters, their smiles as plastic as the hors d'oeuvres. I had slipped in unnoticed, a ghost in a black suit, a quiet observer of my son's moment of supposed triumph. The irony was so rich it was practically dripping off the crystal chandeliers. Here they were, celebrating a success built on my ruin, toasting their future with my past. My eyes scanned the room and found them in the center of a fawning crowd. Daniel, in a suit that probably cost more than my first car, was all charm and charisma, a polished facade of a man. Tiffany, draped in a gown that shimmered with 1,000 secrets, held a champagne flute and beamed at him, the perfect picture of a supportive wife. They were the king and queen of their little kingdom of lies, completely unaware that the jester had just arrived. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. Their reign was about to end. I took a deep breath, clutching the forged document in my handbag like a hidden knife. The time for a quiet, civilized chat was over. This wasn't about an argument.
It was about an ambush. I had to choose the perfect moment. I waited until Daniel stepped onto a small stage to make a toast. The room fell silent, and all eyes were on him. This was my cue. "To success," Daniel announced, his voice booming with confidence. "To innovation, and to the unwavering support of our loved ones." A ripple of applause went through the crowd. This was it. I walked slowly but deliberately toward the stage, my heels clicking a quiet, deadly rhythm on the marble floor. I felt a few eyes on me, people whispering, trying to figure out who this strange woman in black was. Daniel's eyes, however, were fixed on me with a growing horror. The smile melted from his face, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He knew. I stopped at the edge of the stage, directly below him. My voice, when it came, was clear and cutting, a sharp blade through the celebratory hum. "What about the support of the loved ones you've slandered and tried to steal from, Daniel?" I asked, loud enough for the people around us to hear. Tiffany's hand flew to her mouth. She looked like she had just seen a ghost, which, in a way, she had. Daniel sputtered, his face draining of all color. "Mother, what are you doing? This is a private matter." "Private," I laughed, a bitter, grating sound that made several people turn around. "You've made it public, Daniel. You've gone around telling people your own mother is crazy and confused, all to get your hands on my house and my money." I pulled the forged document from my bag and held it up, the paper a damning piece of evidence under the bright lights. "You even forged my signature to steal my life savings to buy a yacht, the one you named the Eleanor's Legacy. It's a crime, Daniel, a federal crime." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of silence you could feel, a living, breathing thing. Everyone was staring, their faces a mix of shock and morbid curiosity. The perfect facade of Daniel and Tiffany's success was crumbling right before their eyes. Daniel's face was a mask of panic, his eyes darting wildly. Tiffany was fumbling with her phone, her hands shaking. They had so carefully constructed their house of cards, and with a single breath, I had blown it all down. This wasn't a victory yet, but it was a moment of profound, soul-deep triumph. But their despair was my victory, and the look of utter betrayal and hatred on my son's face was the sweetest reward. But I knew this was far from over. I had exposed their truth, but they had secrets I couldn't even imagine. What came next was a revelation that would leave me shaken to my very core.
The crowd's silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was a perfect, crystalline moment of justice, a tableau of a life's work being exposed for the fraud it was. But it didn't last. Daniel's face contorted, his panic giving way to a raw, animalistic rage. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice a low, vicious snarl. "How dare you? You have no right to come here and ruin everything." Tiffany, her perfect facade shattered, started shouting. "She's lying. She's old and confused. She made a scene because we told her we needed to take care of her affairs." I stood my ground. "Take care of my affairs? You mean steal my money to buy a boat you named after me as a final pathetic joke?" I held the document up again. "Is this a forgery, Daniel? Are you willing to admit in front of all these people that you committed a felony?" The crowd was buzzing now, a low, horrified murmur. The air was electric with tension. Daniel knew he was cornered. His carefully constructed life was crumbling before his eyes, and his only option was to bring my world down with his. His eyes, now filled with pure hatred, locked onto mine. He looked less like my son and more like a cornered snake. "You want to talk about lies, Mother? Let's talk about the biggest lie you've ever told, the lie you've been living for 60 years, the lie that you are even my mother." The world stopped. The buzzing of the crowd faded to a distant hum.
My heart, which had been a drum of defiance, seized in my chest. I stared at him, my mind a blank, my mouth agape. He stepped closer, his voice filled with a terrible, triumphant malice. "Did you think I'd never find out? Did you think that little secret would stay buried forever?" He looked at the crowd, a manic desperation in his eyes, a final attempt to turn the tables. "She's not my biological mother. She bought me from an orphanage when I was a baby. She's not my family, not by blood, not by anything but a piece of paper. She paid for me. I'm an investment, a transaction, a pawn in a game you made up." The words hit me like a physical blow. The air rushed out of my lungs. I felt dizzy, my head spinning. It was a secret I had held for my entire life, a wound I had tried to heal with a lifetime of love. My late husband and I couldn't have children. We had tried everything. And then we found Daniel, a beautiful, helpless baby boy in an orphanage. We had paid the fees, signed the papers, and loved him as if he were our own flesh and blood. And he was my son every day of his life. But he had found the adoption papers, and he had weaponized them. He had taken my deepest, most vulnerable truth and twisted it into a cruel lie. The stares of the crowd were no longer just curiosity. They were a mix of pity and judgment. I saw some faces turn away in disgust. Daniel and Tiffany's plan was working. They had exposed me, not as a victim of theft, but as a deceitful fraud, a woman who had bought a child and now wanted to reclaim the investment. All the anger, all the righteous indignation drained out of me, replaced by an overwhelming, soul-crushing grief. My public victory had become the most humiliating public defeat. The battle for my house was over, and I had lost everything. Not just my money, but my son's love, my reputation, and the sacred truth I had held so dear. I had fought so hard, only to have my own flesh and blood destroy me with a truth he had turned into a weapon. I turned and stumbled out of the penthouse, the sound of the crowd's murmuring laughter following me. The lights of the city were a blur, and the cold wind felt like a final insult. My life was over. I had lost the fight, and I had lost myself. I had to disappear. But what happened next was the most shocking part of all. My story wasn't over. It was about to get much, much darker.
The city lights, which had seemed so beautiful just moments before, were now a blur of hostile, indifferent stars. I stumbled out of the penthouse, the sound of the crowd's shocked gasps and murmurs echoing in my head. Daniel's words, a poison-tipped arrow aimed straight at my heart, had hit their mark. "She bought me from an orphanage." He had said it with such venom, such gleeful malice, as if the truth were a weapon he had been saving for years. The public victory I had so carefully orchestrated had turned into my most profound, most devastating defeat. The battle for my house, the struggle for my money, all of it now seemed trivial, an empty gesture in the face of this emotional annihilation. He had exposed a secret I had held sacred for a lifetime. Not to win a legal argument, but to destroy me completely. The taxi ride home was a silent, agonizing journey. I didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a cold, empty ache that had taken root in my bones. I had spent my entire life trying to be the perfect mother, the one who loved unconditionally, the one who gave everything without asking for anything in return. I had believed that love was enough to make a family. My son had just proven that it was all a lie, a performance. I wasn't his mother. I was a transaction, a business deal he now regretted. The home I returned to felt like a tomb. The memories I had cherished now felt like ghosts mocking me with a love that had never truly been mine. I collapsed onto the couch, the suit I had worn as armor now feeling like a shroud. I was alone. The phone, which had been silent for days, suddenly started to ring.
My heart pounded with a mix of dread and hope. I ignored it. I was in a cocoon of my own grief, and I didn't want anyone to see me this broken. But it rang again and again. Finally, I looked at the screen. It was Mrs. Gable. I reluctantly answered, my voice a shaky whisper. Eleanor? Are you okay? I just saw the video. It's all over the internet. The video? I asked, my mind still reeling. Someone from the party recorded your confrontation with Daniel, and they posted it. It's everywhere. Everyone is talking about it. My stomach dropped. The humiliation wasn't just confined to that penthouse. It was now a spectacle for the entire world to see. I felt a wave of nausea, the kind that comes from the most profound despair. I had wanted to expose them, to use the court of public opinion, but I never expected the full, brutal truth of my life to be on display. Eleanor, listen to me, she said, her voice firm. It's not what you think. Yes, Daniel said some terrible things, but people are defending you. They're saying you're a hero. They're saying he's a monster. People are leaving comments, sharing their own stories of being betrayed. Your story, it's a spark. It's making people see the truth. I sat up, my mind reeling. A hero? A spark? I was a humiliation, a viral joke. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking, and opened a social media app. There it was, my face distorted by shock and grief next to Daniel's furious, hateful expression. The comments were a firestorm. While a few believed Daniel's cruel lie, the overwhelming majority were siding with me. People I didn't know were calling him a sociopath and a monster. They were sharing their own stories of parental abandonment and filial cruelty. My personal tragedy had become a public anthem for justice. For the first time since he had said those terrible words, I felt a flicker of something other than pain. I had exposed their lies, and in his desperation to defeat me, he had exposed a truth he thought would destroy me. But instead it had backfired. My vulnerability was my strength, my truth, my deep, unconditional love for a boy who wasn't mine by blood was 1,000,000 times more powerful than their pathetic greed. He had tried to expose my shame, but he had only exposed his own emptiness. He had not only failed to win the battle for my house, he had lost the war for his reputation. I had been broken, but I was not defeated. They had underestimated me. They had no idea that a mother's love, even when it is not by blood, is an unbreakable force. I had to continue the fight, not for the house, not for the money, but for the truth. I had to show the world that his cruelty had no power over my love. What happened next wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption. The path to my final victory would be the hardest I had ever walked. What I did next would not only shock my family, but would change my life forever.
The flicker of hope from the night before was now a roaring fire. I wasn't just a scorned mother, I was a symbol, a public battle cry for every parent who had been taken for granted, every elderly person who had been made to feel like a burden. My face, once a symbol of humiliation, was now a banner for justice. The private war for my house and my money had been lost, but the public war for my truth had just begun, and I was going to win it. Not for myself, but for every person who had ever felt invisible. The next day, I didn't hide.
I called a local news station that had picked up the viral video of the party. The reporter, a young woman with a sharp mind and an even sharper haircut, arrived at my home. I sat in my living room, the same room where Daniel and Tiffany had so casually tried to evict me, and I told her everything. I showed her the forged documents. I showed her the financial records that proved they had bought a yacht with my life savings. I even told her about their vile campaign to paint me as senile. But most importantly, I told her about the adoption. I laid my deepest, most painful secret bare for the world to see, not out of shame, but out of defiance. I didn't just tell her about Daniel's cruelty. I told her about the unconditional love I had for him, a love so pure that it transcended blood. I looked directly into the camera, my voice clear and steady, and I told the world that a mother's love isn't a transaction. The story aired that night, and it was a masterpiece. The reporter had framed it perfectly, not as a messy family fight, but as a cautionary tale of greed and betrayal. The comment section exploded. Daniel and Tiffany's social media pages were flooded with condemnation. Their business partners pulled out. Their friends vanished. They were no longer the golden couple of the city. They were pariahs. They had tried to destroy me with lies, and I had destroyed them with the truth. The final act of my denouement came not from a court order, but from a quiet knock on my front door a week later. It was Mr. Thompson, the lawyer, his face pale and his expression grim. He held a thick file. "Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet, "and Daniel and Tiffany have been completely ostracized. Their new venture is dead in the water. Their assets have been seized to cover their debts. They are facing serious legal charges for forgery and fraud. They lost everything. The house is safe. The trust is intact. They tried to sell it, but the media coverage stopped everything in its tracks." I felt a profound sense of relief, but no triumph. I had won the fight for my home, but the emotional war had left scars. I had lost the son I thought I had, and the boy I had raised had become a stranger. My victory was hollow. He had gotten what he deserved, but I had lost a part of my soul in the process. But what I gained was far more valuable than any house or any amount of money. The community, the people who had initially been swayed by Daniel's lies, now rallied around me. Mrs. Gable brought me a new, perfectly baked cake. Neighbors I barely knew offered to help with my garden. My story had resonated with so many people, and in a way, I had found a new, bigger family. The people who saw my truth, who saw my love, were my real family. My old life, the life of a doormat who was willing to give everything for a family that didn't appreciate her, was dead. It was a kind of funeral, a celebration of the woman I was about to become, the woman who was no longer just a mother, but a warrior, the woman who in the end would be remembered not for what she gave away, but for what she was brave enough to fight for. And that was the best outfit I could have ever left myself.